All right. This is my mom's dog, Toby. This is my brother. I like to call him Mr. Eyebrows for obvious reasons. Okay, Toby decided that he wants to join us today as we dive into chapter 18 of A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn. Chapter 18 is titled The Impossible Victory, Vietnam. This chapter, I just posted a video of me crying when I started reading it because, oh my goodness. Although I have heard about the Vietnam War and all of that, I have never actually engaged in a deep dive, but this was a deep dive, and my God, I cannot believe that people were not imprisoned. Actually, no, I can't believe it, because as we know, the ICC, and I don't even think the ICC existed at this time, all these courts, all of these organizations and these institutions that exist to supposedly hold people accountable for warmongering and for being evil, they don't do shit. And as a matter of fact, most of those institutions are run by the people who cause the most harm in the world. So are they really going to hold themselves accountable? No. Yeah, we're going to learn about what happened in Vietnam and why the Vietnam War even happened. Surprise, surprise, it had to do with the United States wanting to control the development of another country's government. And they were terrified of communism, as we have continued to talk about. The United States was terrified that the domino theory would happen, that one country would fall to communism and all countries would fall to communism. They went crazy trying to prevent communist governments from establishing themselves. But the thing is, they could not win. Vietnam and the people of Vietnam, the Vietnamese people, were so unified and were so committed to their liberation that no amount of bombs and threats and scheming by the United States government was able to beat them. And that's why this chapter is titled The Impossible Victory, because no matter what the American government did, they couldn't win. So we're going to dive in. Toby is maybe going to fall asleep. Okay, let's dive into it. From 1964 to 1972, the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of the world made a maximum military effort with everything short of atomic bombs to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement in a tiny peasant country, and failed. When the U.S. fought in Vietnam, it was organized modern technology versus organized human beings, and the human beings won. In the course of that war, there developed in the United States the greatest anti-war movement the nation had ever experienced, a movement that played a critical part in bringing the war to an end. It was another startling fact of the 60s. In the fall of 1945, Japan, defeated, was forced to leave Indochina, the former French colony it had occupied at the start of the war. In the meantime, a revolutionary movement had grown there, determined to end colonial control and to achieve a new life for the peasants of Indochina, led by a communist named Ho Chi Minh. By the way, I didn't know Ho Chi Minh was a person. I thought that was just the name of a city in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was a revolutionary leader. The revolutionists fought against the Japanese, and when they were gone, held a spectacular celebration in Hanoi in late 1945, with 1 million people in the streets, and issued a Declaration of Independence. It borrowed from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in the French Revolution and from the American Declaration of Independence, and began, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just as the Americans in 1776 had listed in their grievances against the English king, the Vietnamese listed their complaints against French rule. They have enforced inhuman laws. They have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots. They have drowned uprisings in rivers of blood. They have fettered public opinion. They have robbed us of our rice fields, our mines, our forests, and our raw materials. They have invented numerous unjustifiable taxes and reduced our people, especially our peasantry, to a state of extreme poverty. From the end of last year to the beginning of this year, more than 2 million of our fellow citizens died of starvation. The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against any attempt by the French colonialists to reconquer their country. The Western powers were already at work to change this. England occupied the southern part of Indochina and then turned it back to the French. Nationalist China, this was under Chiang Kai-shek before the Communist Revolution, occupied the northern part of Indochina, and the United States persuaded it to turn that back to the French. As Ho Chi Minh told an American journalist, "We apparently stand quite alone. We shall have to depend on ourselves." Between October 1945 and February 1946, Ho Chi Minh wrote 8 letters to President Truman, reminding him of the self-determination promises of the Atlantic Charter. One of the letters was sent both to Truman and the United Nations. "I wish to invite attention of Your Excellency for strictly humanitarian reasons to following matter. 2 million Vietnamese died of starvation during the winter of 1944 and spring 1945 because of starvation policy of French who seized and stored until it rotted all available rice. 3/4 of cultivated land was flooded in summer 1945, which was followed by a severe drought. Of normal harvest, 5/6 was lost. Many people are starving. Unless great world powers and international relief organizations bring us immediate assistance, we face imminent catastrophe." Truman never replied. When we see what's happening in Palestine and the intentional starvation of the Palestinians, where do you think that Israel learned that? Who do you think taught them how to do that? In October of 1946, the French bombarded a port in northern Vietnam, and there began the 8-year war between the Viet Minh movement and the French over who would rule Vietnam. After the communist victory in China in 1949 and the Korean War the following year, the United States began giving large amounts of military aid to the French. By 1954, the United States had given 300,000 small arms and machine guns, enough to equip the entire French army in Indochina, and $1 billion altogether. The U.S. was financing 80% of the French war effort. Why was the United States doing this? To the public, the word was that the United States was helping to stop communism in Asia, but there was not much public discussion. In the secret memoranda of the National Security Council, which advised the president on foreign policy, there was talk in 1950 of what came to be known as the domino theory. That, like a row of dominoes, if one country fell to communism, the next one would do the same, and so on. It was important, therefore, to keep the first one from falling. It was also noted that Japan depended on the rice of Southeast Asia, and communist victory there would make it extremely difficult to prevent Japan's eventual accommodation to communism. Vietnam was all about preventing other countries from falling into communism. And the irony of this all, remember the Platt Agreement that we talked about a few chapters ago, how the United States said they wouldn't impose on interfering on any country establishing a new government after they have fought for their independence. Obviously, they lied about that in Cuba. They're not letting the Vietnamese choose their own government. It's these people. And I say these people because although I hold an American passport, I know good and goddamn well. That that government does not represent me. I would be stupid. I would be foolish to believe that. In 1953, a congressional study mission reported the area of Indochina is immensely wealthy in rice, rubber, coal, and iron ore. Its position makes it a strategic key to the rest of Southeast Asia. That year, a State Department memorandum said that the French were losing the war in Indochina, had failed to win a sufficient native support, feared that a negotiated settlement would mean the eventual loss to communism not only of Indochina, but of the whole of Southeast Asia, and concluded if the French actually decided to withdraw, the U.S. would have to consider most seriously whether to take over in this area. In 1954, the French, having been unable to win Vietnamese popular support, which was overwhelmingly behind Ho Chi Minh and the revolutionary movement, had to withdraw. So that's when the U.S. really stepped up and they were like, yeah, we're not going to let this country fall to communism. Or so that's what they thought. The United States moved quickly to prevent the unification and to establish South Vietnam as an American sphere. It set up in Saigon as the head of the government a former Vietnamese official who, I'm going to write his full name here because I don't know how to pronounce it, but we're going to call him DM moving forward. And he had recently been living in New Jersey. And this was now the fucking leader of the southern part of Vietnam because he was a plant. The United States put him there because they knew that he would do whatever they wanted him to do. A memo in early 1954 of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that intelligence estimates showed a settlement based on free elections would be attended by almost certain loss of the associated states, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the 3 parts of Indochina created by the Geneva Conference, to communist control. Diem again and again blocked the elections requested by the Viet Minh, and with American money and arms, his government became more and more firmly established. As the Pentagon Papers put it, South Vietnam was essentially the creation of the United States. The Diem regime became increasingly unpopular. Diem was a Catholic, and most Vietnamese were Buddhists. Diem was close to the landlords, and this was a country of peasants. His pretenses at land reform left things basically as they were. He replaced locally selected provincial chiefs with his own men appointed in Saigon. By 1962, 88% of these provincial chiefs were military men. Diem imprisoned more and more Vietnamese who criticized the regime for corruption, for lack of reform. Okay, by now we know. The French left Indochina, but as the Vietnamese people fought for their independence, they were leaning towards a communist structure. The United States was not going to allow that to happen because it was worried that if Vietnam fell to communism, so would Indochina, which is now like Laos, Cambodia, and they were worried that Japan would fall to it. So they decided that they were going to invade Vietnam and create an example out of them and hopefully defeat Ho Chi Minh, who was a revolutionary leader at the time. And that's basically where we're at right now. Opposition grew quickly in the countryside where Diem's apparatus could not reach well. And around 1958, guerrilla activities began against the regime. Remember, Diem is now the puppet that the United States has put in South Vietnam to do its bidding because the United States is equipping Diem and people within that region to fight against North Vietnam, where Ho Chi Minh and the revolutionary leaders were. In 1960, the National Liberation Front was formed in the South. It united the various strands of opposition to the regime. Its strength came from the South Vietnamese peasants who saw it as a way of changing their daily lives. A U.S. government analyst named Douglas Pike, in his book Viet Cong, based on interviews with rebels and captured documents, tried to give a realistic assessment of what the United States faced. In the 2,561 villages of South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front created a host of nationwide socio-political organizations in a country where mass organizations were virtually non-existent. Aside from the NLF, there had never been a truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam. Pike wrote, "The communists have brought to the villages of South Vietnam significant social change and have done so largely by means of the communication process. That is, they were organizers much more than they were warriors. What struck me most forcibly about the NLF was its totality as a social revolution first and as a war second. Pike was impressed with the mass involvement of the peasants in the movement. The rural Vietnamese was not regarded simply as a pawn in a power struggle, but as the active element in the thrust. He was the thrust." Pike estimated that the NLF membership by early 1962 stood at around 300,000. The Pentagon Papers said of this period, only the Viet Cong had any real support and influence on a broad base of the countryside. We're going to fast forward a bit here, but Diem, who was the plant that was put in South Vietnam by the United States government to do their bidding, was taken by the people, him and his brother, and they were executed. 3 weeks after the execution of Diem, Kennedy himself was assassinated and his vice president Lyndon Johnson took office. The generals who succeeded Diem could not suppress the National Liberation Front, the NLF. Again and again, American leaders expressed their bewilderment at the popularity of the NLF, at the high morale of its soldiers. Remember, the NLF was comprised of the people, peasants, people who wanted liberation, who were represented by Ho Chi Minh. McNamara told the American public that there was an attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on American destroyers while on routine patrol in international waters. McNamara said, "The U.S. destroyer Maddox underwent an unprovoked attack. It later turned out that the Gulf of Tonkin episode was a fake, that the highest American officials had lied to the public, just as they had in the invasion of Cuba under Kennedy. In fact, the CIA had engaged in a secret operation attacking North Vietnamese coastal installations. So if there had been an attack, it would not have been unprovoked. It was not a routine patrol because the Maddox was on a special electronic spying mission, and it was not in international waters but in Vietnamese territorial waters. It turned out that no torpedoes were fired at the Maddox, as McNamara said. Another reported attack on another destroyer 2 nights later, which Johnson called open aggression on the high seas, seems also to have been an invention. The Tonkin attack that was used as a means for the United States to get the public to agree to further involvement in Vietnam was actually all a lie. It was made up to buy the support of the American people to spend more money and to send their soldiers to fight in Vietnam against the revolutionary leaders in South Vietnam and North Vietnam, because the NLF was also present in the South, where the U.S. had put their government officials. The Tonkin attack brought a congressional resolution passed unanimously in the House, and with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate, giving Johnson the power to take military action as he saw fit in Southeast Asia. 2 months before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, U.S. leaders met in Honolulu and discussed such a resolution. Rusk said in this meeting, according to the Pentagon Papers, that public opinion on the Southeast Asia policy was badly divided in the U.S. at the moment, and that therefore the president needed an affirmation of support. This was 2 months before they said that the Maddox was attacked. And we know that that's a lie. Immediately after the Tonkin affair, American warplanes began bombarding North Vietnam. During 1965, over 200,000 American soldiers were sent to South Vietnam, and in 1966, 200,000 more. By early 1968, there were more than 500,000 American troops there, and the U.S. Air Force was dropping bombs at a rate unequaled in history. Large areas of South Vietnam were declared free fire zones, which meant that all persons remaining within them, civilians, old people, children, were considered an enemy, and bombs were dropped at will. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were subject to search and destroy missions. Men of military age in the villages were killed, the homes were burned, the women, the children, and the old people were sent off to refugee camps. Jonathan Schell, in his book The Village of Ben Suk, describes such an operation. A village surrounded, attacked, a man riding on a bicycle shot down, 3 people picnicking by the river shot to death, the houses destroyed, the women, children, old people herded together, taken away from their ancestral homes. The CIA in Vietnam, in a program called Operation Phoenix, secretly without trial executed at least 20,000 civilians in South Vietnam who were suspected of being members of the communist underground. A pro-administration analyst wrote in the journal Foreign Affairs in January 1975, although the Phoenix program did undoubtedly kill or incarcerate many innocent civilians, it did also eliminate many members of the communist infrastructure. Oh, okay, yeah, you know what? This doesn't make any sense, so you cannot even try to post-rationalize the way that these people think and process reality. After the war, the release of records of the International Red Cross showed that in South Vietnamese prison camps, where at the height of the war 65,000 to 70,000 people were held and often beaten and tortured, American advisors observed and sometimes participated. By the end of the Vietnam War, 7 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Vietnam, more than twice the total bombs dropped on Europe and Asia in World War II. Almost one 500-pound bomb for every human being in Vietnam. It was estimated that there were 20 million bomb craters in the country. In addition, poisonous sprays were dropped by planes to destroy trees and any kind of growth. Oh my god, I already read this, but this is like... In addition, poisonous sprays were dropped by planes to destroy trees and any kind of growth. An area the size of Massachusetts was covered with such poison. Vietnamese mothers reported birth effects of their children. Yale biologists using the same poison on mice reported defective mice born and said they had no reason to believe the effect on humans was different. Fucking evil, man. Journalist Seymour Hersh, in his book My Lai 4, writes, when Army investigators reached the Barren area in November 1969 in connection with the My Lai probe in the United States, they found mass graves at 3 sites, as well as a ditch full of bodies. It was estimated that between 450 to 500 people, most of them women, children, and old men, had been slain and buried there. The Army tried to cover... Oh, Toby, I'm okay. I'm okay. I know. The Army tried to cover up what happened. The story of the massacre had appeared in May 1968 in 2 French publications, one called Sud Vietnam and Lutte, and another one published by the North Vietnamese delegation to the peace talks in Paris, but the American press did not pay any attention. Several of the officers in the My Lai massacre were put on trial, but only Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty. There's a part that I didn't read, but it's basically Lieutenant William Calley was the one that was forcing soldiers to kill innocent people, and so he was the one that was found guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but his sentence was reduced twice. He served 3 years. Nixon ordered that he be put under house arrest rather than regular prison, and then he was paroled. The unpopularity of the Saigon government explains the success of the NLF in infiltrating Saigon and other government-held towns in early 1968, without the people there warning the government. The NLF thus launched a surprise offensive that carried them into the heart of Saigon, into a specific airfield that was there, and it immobilized it. Even occupied the American embassy briefly. The offensive was beaten back, but it demonstrated that all of the enormous firepower delivered on Vietnam by the United States had not destroyed the NLF, its morale, its popular support, its will to fight. It caused a reassessment in the American government, more doubts among the American people. The heavy bombs were intended to destroy the will of the ordinary Vietnamese to resist, as in the bombings of German and Japanese population centers in World War II, despite President Johnson's public insistence that only military targets were being bombed. The government was using language like one more turn of the screw to describe bombing. The CIA at one point in 1966 recommended a bombing program of greater intensity, according to the Pentagon Papers, directed against, in the CIA's words, the will of the regime as a target system. Meanwhile, just across the border of Vietnam, in a neighboring country, Laos, where a right-wing government installed by the CIA faced rebellion, one of the most beautiful areas in the world, the Plain of Jars was being destroyed by bombing. I'm skipping some stuff here, but it's really, really important that if you have the book, you read this thoroughly, because it has firsthand accounts of people that are talking about what happened. And there's one section that just keeps talking about the holes. Like, there were so many holes from the bombs, but also people were digging holes to build trenches for themselves to be saved and spared from the bombing attacks. By early 1968, the cruelty of the war began touching the conscience of many Americans. For many others, the problem was that the United States government was unable to win the war. While 40,000 American soldiers were dead by this time, 250,000 wounded, with no end in sight. And then it says that the Vietnam casualties were many times this number. Lyndon Johnson had escalated a brutal war and failed to win it. His popularity was at an all-time low. He could not appear publicly without demonstration against him and the war. The chant, LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today, was heard in demonstrations throughout the country. There's so many parallels to right now, man. There's so many parallels to right fucking now. That adds a layer to reading this book, because it's like, it would be one thing if we're reading history and we're not reliving it in some way, shape, or form right now. If we were able to read this and say, wow, what the policies of the past were freaking horrible, but thank God we have moved forward and we're different now. But we're not. Nothing has changed. And that's what adds so much to this experience of reading this book. Many of you were not born when this book came out, and yet are living the pieces of history that are written here within a different context that uses the same exact tactics. That is horrible. That is incensing. That is beyond me, because what it shows is that although we have progressed in some ways, in many ways we have not. And that is so freaking sad, because so many years have passed for us to be talking about the same shit and for the same evil people to be still in power, doing the same thing to innocent people as a means to an end, benefiting the same exact people that these wars benefited in the 60s. It's fucking insane. In the spring of 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run again for president and that negotiations for peace would begin with the Vietnamese in Paris. In the fall of 1968, Richard Nixon, pledging that he would get the United States out of Vietnam, was elected president. He began to withdraw troops. By February 1972, less than 150,000 were left, but the bombing continued. Nixon's policy was Vietnamization. The Saigon government, with Vietnamese ground troops using American money and air power, would carry on the war. Nixon was not ending the war. He was ending the most unpopular aspect of it, the involvement of American soldiers on the soil of a faraway country. In the spring of 1970, Nixon and the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, launched an invasion of Cambodia. After a long bombardment that the government never disclosed to the public, the invasion not only led to an outcry of protests in the United States, it was a military failure, and Congress resolved that Nixon could not use American troops in extending the war without congressional approval. The following year, without American troops, the United States supported a South Vietnamese invasion of Laos. This too failed. In 1971, 800,000 tons of bombs were dropped by the United States on Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Meanwhile, the Saigon military regime, headed by President Nguyen Van Thieu, the last of a long succession of Saigon chiefs of state, was keeping thousands of opponents in jail. Some of the first signs of opposition in the United States to the Vietnam War came out of the civil rights movement. Perhaps because the experience of Black people with the government led them to distrust any claim that it was fighting for freedom. On the very day that Lyndon Johnson was telling the nation in early August 1964 about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and announcing the bombing of North Vietnam, Black and white activists were gathering near Philadelphia, Mississippi at a memorial service for 3 civil rights workers killed there that summer. The SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, declared in early 1966 that the United States is pursuing an aggressive policy in violation of international law and called for withdrawal from Vietnam. That summer, 6 members of SNCC were arrested for an invasion of an induction center in Atlanta. They were convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. Around the same time, Julian Bond, a SNCC activist who had just been elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, spoke out against the war and the draft, and the House voted that he not be seated because his statements violated the Selective Service Act. and tend to bring discredit to the House. The Supreme Court restored Bond to his seat, saying that he had the right to free expression under the First Amendment, which I found shocking that they actually did that. One of the great sports figures of the nation, Muhammad Ali, the black boxer and heavyweight champion, refused to serve in what he called a white man's war. Boxing authorities took away his title as a champion. Young men began to refuse to register for the draft, refused to be inducted if called. As early as May 1964, the slogan, "We won't go," was widely publicized. Some who registered began publicly burning their draft cards to protest the war. One, David O'Brien, burned his draft card in South Boston. He was convicted, and the Supreme Court overruled his argument that this was protected form of free expression. In October of 1967, there were organized draft card turn-ins all over the country. In San Francisco alone, 300 draft cards were returned to the government. Just before a huge demonstration at the Pentagon that month, a sack of collected draft cards was presented to the Justice Department. By mid-1965, 380 prosecutions were begun against men refusing to be inducted. By mid-1968, that figure was up to 3,300. At the end of 1969, there were 33,960 delinquents nationwide. In 1969, the Oakland Induction Center, where draftees reported from all of Northern California, reported that of 4,400 men ordered to report for induction, 2,400 did not show up. In the first quarter of 1970, the selective service system for the first time could not meet its quota. The poet Robert Lowell, invited to a White House function, refused to come. Arthur Miller, also invited, sent a telegram to the White House: "When the guns boom, the arts die." Singer Eartha Kitt was invited to a luncheon on the White House lawn and shocked all those present by speaking out in the presence of the president's wife against the war. A teenager called to the White House to accept a prize came and criticized the war. In Hollywood, local artists erected a 60-foot tower of protest on Sunset Boulevard. At the National Book Award ceremonies in New York, 50 authors and publishers walked out on a speech by Vice President Humphrey in a display of anger at his role in the war. Middle-class and professional people, unaccustomed to activism, began to speak up. In May 1970, the New York Times reported 1,000 establishment lawyers joined war protest. Corporations began to wonder whether the war was going to hurt their long-range business interests. The Wall Street Journal began criticizing the continuation of the war. As the war became more and more unpopular, people in or close to the government began to break out of the circle of assent. The most dramatic instance was the case of Daniel Ellsberg. So as the Vietnam War became more and more unpopular, people within the government began to go against the policies of the government, and the major instance was in the case of Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was a Harvard-trained economist, a former Marine officer employed by the RAND Corporation, which did special, often secret research for the U.S. government. Ellsberg helped write the Department of Defense history of the war in Vietnam, and then decided to make the top-secret document public with the aid of his friend Anthony Russo, a former RAND Corporation man. The two had met in Saigon, where both had been affected in different experiences by direct sight of the war, and had become powerfully indignant at what the United States was doing to the people of Vietnam. Ellsberg and Russo spent night after hours at a friend's advertising agency duplicating the 7,000-page document. Then Ellsberg gave copies to various congressmen and to the New York Times. In June 1971, the Times began printing selections from what came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. It created a national sensation. The government then indicted Ellsberg and Russo for violating the Espionage Act by releasing classified documents to unauthorized people. They faced long terms in prison if convicted. The judge, however, called off the trial during the jury deliberations because the Watergate events unfolding at the time revealed unfair practices by the prosecution. Ellsberg, by his bold act, had broken with the usual tactic of dissidents inside the government who bided their time and kept their opinions to themselves, hoping for small changes in policy. A colleague urged him not to leave the government because he had access, saying, "Don't cut yourself off, don't cut your throat." Ellsberg replied, "Life exists outside of the executive branch." After Ellsberg, there were just a lot of examples written here of people who went against the government, who were disrupting as part of the anti-war movement. Priests and nuns of the Catholic Church. Students were heavily involved in the early protests against the war. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which began at the University of Michigan, and which issued the Port Huron Statement in 1962, a manifesto for participatory democracy, played an important part in organizing the anti-war protests. The climax of protests came in the spring of 1970 when President Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia at Kent State University in Ohio. On May 4th, when students gathered to demonstrate against the war, National Guardsmen fired into the crowd. 4 students were killed. One was paralyzed for life. Students at 400 colleges and universities went on strike in protest. It was the first general student strike in the history of the United States. During that school year of 1969 to 1970, the FBI listed 1,785 student demonstrations, including the occupation of 313 buildings. The commencement day ceremonies after the Kent State killings were unlike any the nation had ever seen. Student protests against the ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Program, resulted in the canceling of these programs in over 40 colleges and universities. In 1966, 191,000 college students enrolled in ROTC. By 1973, the number was 72,000. The ROTC was depended on to supply half the officers in Vietnam. In September 1973, for the sixth straight month, the ROTC could not fill its quota. So basically what ended up happening is that soldiers were defecting. Soldiers were leaving their military bases. They were refusing to participate. They were going to prison. The dissidents spread to the war front itself. So this was happening in Vietnam. This was happening on military bases in the United States. There were people who knew they were going to be sent to Vietnam who refused to participate even though they were already enlisted and they were part of the military. And so they were put in prisons. From what I'm reading here, it's just example after example after example of veterans back from Vietnam being very vocal about not wanting more soldiers to be sent, trying to make people aware of what was happening on the ground. Most of the anti-war action came from ordinary GIs, and most of these came from lower income groups: white, black, Native American, Chinese, and Chicano. Pentagon officials in Washington and Navy spokesmen in San Diego announced after the United States withdrew its troops from Vietnam in 1973 that the Navy was going to purge itself of undesirables, and that these included as many as 6,000 men in the Pacific Fleet, a substantial proportion of them black. Example after example of people just defecting. Basically, Henry Kissinger continued to encourage the president to just bomb even more. He was a menace. He was a warmonger. He was an absolute devil, to be honest with you. That man, I cannot believe, got to live his life in freedom because of the shit that man encouraged the US government to do. The Vietnam War gave clear evidence, at least for that war, making one wonder about the others. The political leaders were the last to take steps to end the war. The people were far ahead. The president was always far behind. The Supreme Court silently turned away from cases challenging the constitutionality of the war. Congress was years behind public opinion, which I think is what we're seeing right now in Palestine as well. The government is not listening to us, and when it does listen to us, it will have already been too late, because we have already been very clear about what we want to see happen, and that is the end of wars, period. The end of killing of innocent people, period. The end of infiltrating governments and populations, indigenous populations, for the no more. It was only after the intervention in Cambodia ended, and only after the nationwide campus uproar over that invasion, that Congress passed a resolution declaring that American troops should not be sent into Cambodia without its approval. And it was not until late 1973, when American troops had finally been removed from Vietnam, that Congress passed a bill limiting the power of the president to make war without congressional consent. Even there, in that war powers resolution, the president could make war for 60 days on his own without a congressional declaration. The administration tried to persuade the American people that the war was ending because of its decision to negotiate a peace, not because it was losing the war, not because of the powerful anti-war movement in the United States, but the government's own secret memoranda all through the war testified to its sensitivity at each stage about public opinion in the United States and abroad. The data is in the Pentagon Papers. Okay, this is the final video for chapter 18. Toby is falling asleep on my arm, and I'm trying to... Oh, you're not sleeping. Okay. When Nixon took office, he too tried to persuade the public that protests would not affect him. But he almost went berserk when one lone pacifist picketed the White House. The frenzy of Nixon's actions against dissidents, plans for burglaries, wiretapping, mail openings suggests the importance of the anti-war movement in the minds of national leaders. One sign that the ideas of the anti-war movement had taken hold in the American public was that juries became more reluctant to convict anti-war protesters, and local judges too were treating them differently. The American troops were leaving Vietnam, and there was a correspondent that wrote in the New York Times, "The U.S. emerges as the big loser, and history books must admit this. We lost the war in the Mississippi Valley, not in the Mekong Valley." successive American governments were never able to muster the necessary mass support at home. In fact, the United States had lost the war both in Mekong Valley and the Mississippi Valley. It was the first clear defeat to the global American empire formed after World War II. It was administered by revolutionary peasants abroad and by astonishing movements of protests back home. At home. Back on September 26, 1969, President Richard Nixon, noting the growing anti-war activity all over the country, announced that under no circumstance will I be affected. Under no circumstance will I be affected, whatever by it. But 9 years later, in his memoirs, he admitted that the anti-war movement caused him to drop plans for intensification of the war. Although publicly, I continued to ignore the raging anti-war controversy, I knew, however, that after all the protests and the moratorium, American public opinion would be seriously divided by any military escalation of the war. It was a rare presidential admission of the power of public protests. From a long-range viewpoint, something perhaps even more important that had happened. The rebellion at home was spreading beyond the issue of war in Vietnam. And that's the end of chapter 18. I hope that this was concise, but also informative. I skipped a lot of details. I just don't think I have it in me to go into every little thing, because these videos would be super long, but also this is energetically exhausting, and I've talked about that a few times. Reading this is insane, and also just noticing in my brain how I'm reading certain things and it's bringing me to the present moment and what's happening in the world. It's just a lot. And so thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for staying here. Thank you for listening to this information and for choosing to lean in, because many people are not capable of listening to these truths. It is paradigm shifting and shattering, and I get it. It's really difficult, but we have to do this. We have to know what's going on. Otherwise, we continue to be part of the problem by choosing to be ignorant. So again, sending y'all lots of love. Take care of yourselves, and thanks for choosing to spend time with me.